with breaking news. Thanks for staying with us. This is Standpoint. We're looking at the face-off between the federal government and the organized labor over the new minimum wage. Labor is proposing 615,000 naira. The government says it can pay 48,000 naira, while organized private sector, it's saying it can only pay 54,000 naira. We're joined by human rights lawyer Malaki Gumadu. Thank you for staying with us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be back.
All right. So you were talking about the negotiation, or the strategy of the labor union before we went on break, and I was asking you. When you look at how Labour has gone about this negotiation from the beginning, it started with about 1 million naira and then cut it down to, I think was it 800,000 before it moved to another 615,000 naira. And, people have said, look, some of this figure has been unrealistic. Even TUC had a different figure of about over 400,000 naira. When you look at all of this strategy, from the very beginning, do you think that government would have looked at that and said, look, they don't seem to be serious with this negotiation, and perhaps that also influenced government's position?
To a large extent, I would think so, to a very large extent. The whole essence of having these labor centers is to be able to aggregate the position of the workforce in different categories that they control, but come out with a common position and a common front. It is actually that togetherness, that communality of purpose that strengthens the labor movement. In short, when it was escalated to incorporate the civil society, when we therefore had what you called LASCO, under the leadership of Comrade Adams Oshomole and Bekor and Sonkuti, the divide, you could see that the country will not move forward except the masses of the country take a position. Now, this is the point I make. Where the government that is very, very indisposed to paying living wage as to minimum wage begin to notice, without being told, some cracks, some discrepancies, and in very bad situations, some ambivalence in the positions of the labor centers, they cash in on that. In short, if they want to be very sinister, they begin to reach out to the section of the labor that is less fastidious in the positions. So I have made this point that where you assess such a situation and juxtapose it with statements coming from some of the leaders of the labor force, you will see that a very smart team on the government side will understand that there are cracks and that the center cannot hold with these people. So, but what is to be done is to leave out all of those aspects of the challenge and focus on what the law says. The national minimum wage is not hanging in the air. The national minimum wage is a function of law. And I'm saying that under Section 4 of that law, the wage is supposed to be reviewed. In short, it lapses, it expires, that's the language of the law, every 5 years. That alone strengthens the hands of the labor movement in the present negotiation going on. Since the government will never remember to review the minimum wage, in spite of the very harsh policies that they throw out every day, labor should go into massive sensitization of the Nigerian people, carry the stakeholders along, build a consensus that will make it almost impregnable, almost impossible for government to break their ranks. But where you begin to talk at cross purposes and walk in different directions and unable to build a consensus that will reflect the unity and the strength of the labor centers, government will naturally come in to break your ranks. Now, by the time you leave that stage and you are now beginning to apply your plan B, which is to move the workers in protest of the government position, by that time you have created a lot of confusion, not just before the government, but even before and amongst your own members. Now, let me make this last point, because you earlier asked about the legal implications. The law is so firm on this minimum wage issue that even where workers and employees by agreement decide to pay and receive wages lower than the one accepted as the national minimum wage, below which no Nigerian worker should be paid, the law regards it as void. In other words, that exercise of yours that took the minimum wage below the acceptable national minimum wage becomes a nullity. So I'll make the point that from the standpoint of the labor force, and when I say labor force, the Nigerian workers, both private and public, in addition to the support of the law, National Minimum Wage Act 2019, together with the economic realities of the time, where petroleum subsidy on petroleum products have been removed arbitrarily, if you ask me. I have not seen anywhere in the world where there is no subsidy to subsidize the essential services and products in the country. I've not seen anyone. If you juxtapose all of these, put them side by side, you will see that Labour has a very credible argument. What is left is how far can they go in pushing the position of workers with respect to this.
And before we get to the credibility of Labour's argument, but I also wanted to ask, when you look how there's a sense of urgency to this matter because of some of the issues you just mentioned, the removal of fees subsidy, increase in tariff for electricity, and inflation rate and all of that. So there is a sense of urgency, and I'm not sure if Nigerian workers can if they care about this back and forth between Labour and the federal government and all of the press conferences in between. How fast should this bargaining process be?
So, if you're asking about the time frame within which this should happen, I would say it would have been yesterday. And the reason is simple. It is that as far as the law is concerned, the extant minimum wage of 30,000 naira is no longer valid by the force of law. And I keep referencing the Section 4 of the National Minimum Wage Act 2019. So if we're really a nation guided by law, we needn't come to this point before we go into negotiation, before the fourth and back. Look at the very first negotiation between government and the labor forces. It broke down completely. Now, it is not very clear. It is just being rumored that they are likely going to go back to the negotiation from next week. But supposing without concealing that doesn't happen, it will mean that we have been operating an illegal minimum wage regime for as long as the one in existence has elapsed. So if you are interested in knowing how fast it should be, I say it would have been yesterday. However, I imagine that you are speaking realistically, that now that we didn't have it that yesterday as I proposed, it should be as quickly as possible. And that should not take us more than a fortnight if we're very serious about this. The way it operates is that it is even in the enlightened interest of government, the same government that is running away from an increased living wage. It is in their enlightened interest, because if you meet the workers at the point where it is reasonable that they should be, you are invariably increasing productivity in many respects. You are guaranteeing a healthy workforce that can maximize their potentials and be fully utilized for the business of production in the country. But above all, you are also tackling the very high incidence of insecurity in the country. Because let's face it, when the people can no longer fend for themselves, either by reason of the purchasing power of the salary they earn or the wage they receive, water will always seek its level. You will have from their ranks people who will not just drop dead, but would want to circumvent the law and take, albeit illegal steps, to be able to sustain themselves and their families. But when there is a reasonable appreciation of all of these issues, and the government meets labor at a middle point or at a reasonable point, you will be unwittingly defeating these transgressions, negative development in the polity, in a way that enables you to provide services that they need. So it is even in their enlightened interest that it happens as quickly as possible. And in my view, a fortnight from today will not be too long a time when Nigeria should settle this aspect, review the Minimum Wage Act to reflect the new minimum wage, and then move forward from there.
All right. So we are now also joined, in the conversation in the studio by a human capacity development professional and a policy analyst. He is Michael Adeleye. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
All right. So let me bring you into the conversation. I don't know if you've been following all that Mr. Gumadu has been talking about, but let me get your thoughts on the figures that have been put forward by the government, that's both the federal and the state government, 48,000 naira. The organized private sector went, a bit higher than the government. They added 6,000 naira to theirs, making 54,000 naira. But when you look at the difference between what they have put, on the table, which of these figures, are unreasonable? Is it that of the government or the 615,000 naira of the organized labor?
Yeah, thank you very much. Personally, I think looking at my classification and what is actually happening within the economy based on this minimum wage, I don't think we should be talking about minimum wage as we speak. We should be talking about standard living wage. Because if we're talking about minimum wage, every state, every community, every environment has different economic development values. And you can't have a universal blanket amount of money that everybody should be earning. If I live in Lagos and I'm earning 48,000 or 56,000, compared to someone that's living in a village in Maiduguri, for example, our standard of living differs. So putting a blanket universal minimum wage onto the entirety of the nation, I don't think is right. I should be asking the government what indices, what index did they actually use to come about that figure? Looking at the prices of what we have in the market, the prices and the value of services that people actually opt for, I mean, would those prices and those wages commensurate with the level of inflationary status that we have in the country now? No, I don't think it's right.
But some have also said, look, the 615,000 naira from the labor is also not reasonable. That, look, you don't want to bleed the government dry. The government cannot be earning, money just to pay salaries, especially the state governments, just to pay, who are still very dependent on allocation, from the center, and they cannot use all their money to pay salaries. At what point, do you think that, well, maybe this figure, some have said 100,000, some have said even more, but what figure is reasonable? And can our economics today or economy today support that figure?
That was what I did made it clear earlier, that we shouldn't be talking about minimum wage. we have a National Bureau of Statistics who could actually put the figures on the table. Every state has different economic status. That's what you'll be looking at. If I'm about 60-year-old and I'm still working and I'm earning 48,000 or 615,000, are you going to compare my living standard with somebody who is just about 17, 18, who is also working? It can't be the same. So the government can make a proposal. There should be a consultation, national consultation. Each state should understand where they stand economically before they can actually say this is how much. You can't have universal. It's not going to work. It's absolutely not going to work. So either the government proposal of 48,000 or the Nigerian Labour Congress of 615,000, it's still not going to work. It has every community, every state, every individual has a different living. So they could make a proposal, then all the state governments will come together and begin to say, right, this is the economic value or nature of my state. So this is how much we can afford based on the economic values of my state. So that's what you'll be looking at. So
and I understand what you're saying,
yeah,
because this is obtainable in countries like the US and Canada.
And the UK
where,
as well,
and
yeah.
the UK, where, there is this is the minimum wage, but you can decide, every state decides whether to add to it or stay with it.
Yeah.
Shouldn't there be at least the minimum? And in these countries as well, for example, UK, there is a minimum wage and there is a living wage.
Living wage,
very
yeah.
different. They're both
absolutely,
very different.
yeah.
And so shouldn't that be at least the minimum? This is the minimum you should do. If you have enough money, you can add to it. If you don't have enough money, you can at least don't pay less than this.
You see, that's a very good question. But the point is, what are the indices that we're going to have to use? The government can't just come up and say, we're proposing 48,000. I'm going to ask the question, how did they come about that 48,000? Look, if the government has a national consultation, they work with the Nigerian Labour Congress, with working classes and everybody. Now, they're going to come up with the actual indices they actually use to come up with a figure that they're going to have to propose as a minimum wage. So everybody will understand that based on A, B, C, X, Y, Z, the government, of course, like you rightly said earlier, we can't milk the government dry. If you ask 1 million people today, they're going to give you different figures. So which figure are we going to follow? So, but we should understand the reason and how that figure was calculated. So it will be understandably to every sector, every facet of the economy, of everyone in the country, that this is what is being based on. So you have a minimum wage, then you also then have a living wage. That's how it's been done. But you can't just have a universal, one singular figure of a minimum wage. It's not tenable.
All right, let me get Mr. Malaki's thought on this one as well. Mr. Gumadu, you've listened to Mr. Adele here talking about how we cannot have one minimum wage for every state because of the capacity of every state. And then, the differences in the standard of living for every state. And, some people will say it's true if you're living in a place like Lagos or River State, where these are high, or Abuja, where things are quite expensive. You can't compare that to someone who is living in a place like Ebonyi, or a place like Maiduguri, like he mentioned. And so it should be different. I also want to get your thought on that.
Well, that's a very important dimension to this discourse. But for me, and as a lawyer, that speaks to the question of functional federalism, where the different federating units are expected to organize the lives of citizens within the subnational entities according to their capacities and pace. And this is not peculiar to Nigeria. I'm glad you mentioned the Great Britain, Canada, Switzerland, even Uganda here, and India. So it is not strange. Federalism as a concept of government is about the juxtaposition of power, be it government power, labor power, across the tiers of government, such that what you have here may not be applicable here. But you see, the federalism we practice in Nigeria has become very questionable in so many respects, inclusive of the wages that workers go home with. But please, let us draw a distinction here. What we're discussing is what should be national minimum wage it doesn't mean that there cannot be other layers of payment. What it means is that this is the minimum wage beyond which no Nigerian worker should be paid. As we speak, what Edo State pays to her workforce is different from what Lagos pays. In fact, there are some states, I think Lagos inclusive, but Edo in particular, that pays well above the last minimum wage. And as I understand it, I'm not from Edo State, I'm from Delta. But as I understand it, I heard that Edo State has even accepted the 40,000 naira minimum wage and had gone ahead to jack up their minimum wage up to that level. You could argue that that's not a very good decision to take in the twilight of this administration when another administration is expected. But this is the point. It is that you cannot, in the bid to satisfy the need of a heterogeneous society such as ours, in which some states are more in a disadvantaged level, begin to force a uniform payment rate on every person. It is good, in my view, to have this national minimum wage. It is good. And what Labour did rightly, in my view, having criticized what they did wrongly, is that they were able to come figure for figure, subhead for subhead, and came out with the amount that they came out with to deal with issues of transportation, health, education, and other essential services, and allocated amount to those figures. When government said 40,000 naira, we didn't hear for once what they meant, the breakdown of that 40,000 naira. You and I, who use vehicles, can tell you conveniently, depending on the car you are using, that 40,000 naira, in my own case, may not be enough to fill your tank today. So where do you start from? How did the government come by 40,000 naira? To what extent can that really, in all conscience, good conscience, operate as a national minimum? And you see, when you trivialize these things, what you do, perhaps unintended, is that you are promoting every other opportunity for people to circumvent the rules and then cut corners. Because where you cannot survive, nature will demand that you will find a way to survive. So I agree largely that states should be allowed. In short, what they can do is to increase it, is to pay more than what the minimum wage prescribes. But what the law sets out to achieve, whether the National Minimum Wage Act, I refer to 2019, or the one to be amended, is to ensure that given the economic realities in the country, given the purchasing power of our currency, given the exigencies of living in Nigeria, no Nigerian worker should be paid below so and so amount. And that's the purpose of that.
Let me just quickly state that, Edo State is currently paying 70,000 naira minimum wage, even before this whole conversation started. The federal government itself is also paying 75,000, and that because of all the additions that were made as a result of the removal of fuel subsidy. And that's why a lot of people are surprised that if you're currently paying, because of the consolidated salary, structure, you're currently paying 75,000 naira. How come there is now a conversation of 48,000 naira? It will seem as though it is the states that are the issue here. Considering what the states are currently earning, there's an increase in allocation because of the removal of fuel subsidy. what do you think that, the minimum, and I know you've talked about standard living, I'm not even talking about minimum wage, but what should be the minimum that every state should be able to pay its worker?
So you hit the nail on the head.
Just a minute, Mr. Ugomadu. The question is for Mr. Dele. I'll get your contribution in just a moment.
Oh, very well.
Right. I love one of the things that the barrister just mentioned earlier. What is the purchasing power of our currency as of today? Looking at the prices and the inflationary level where we are at the moment, 33.2%. That is staggering. So basically, if you have, about a couple of years ago, it was 22%. Okay? So if you have 100,000 about 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and the same 100,000 now means what? It means about you're going to have about just about, it equates to about 70 to 85,000 naira. So the purchasing power of that 100,000 has actually depleted. So if you're now talking, that was the reason why I did mention earlier that what are the calculations, what are the things that the government put in place to come about with that figure? Now, for me, if someone asks me now, how much do I think the minimum wage should be, I will peg it around about 100,000. And the reason for that is, every time we have economic problem, like the removal of the fuel subsidy, transportation prices went up, rental, people that rent houses, the rental, goes up, the purchasing prices for all foods that we eat, jacked up. So what you used to buy at 1,000 naira, you can agree with me, it's been sold for about between 2,000 and 2,500. So if you are on the minimum wage, the question is, will that be sustainable? But if we all understand the calculation and the reasons why the government has actually made to decide and peg it at 48,000, then it runs across. It's like a value chain. Everybody understands. Even if I increase the prices of my goods, I'm not going to get a buyer because they're not going to get money extra from anywhere. You did mention earlier that the governments were paying 75,000. Why is it now they're coming back to 48,000 minimum wage? It wasn't, how can I put this, an amended, law to actually pay 75,000. It was because it was to cushion the effects of the fuel subsidy. And the mistake the government made was they didn't actually announce the tenure, the duration of time they're going to be paying that money. So now, when you increase when you're paying the civil servant, the federal civil servant 75,000 naira, they would have pegged their expenditure around that 75,000. So eventually, it drops to 48,000. Then more crisis. So what I'm actually asking the government to do now is, we're saying in every civilized economy, there's always a minimum wage and a living wage. But they explain after consultation, a wide universal consultation, they come out to the public and tell them what calculation, what they use to come to arrive at that figure. If everybody knows what the government actually used to calculate and come to that 48,000, for example, we will all adjust to that 48,000 naira. So it's not going to be like, okay, it's 48 today.
But you have mentioned, sorry to butt in here, but you've mentioned at least 100,000 naira.
Yeah.
Have you also put the private sector into consideration? And then let's not also forget the consequential salary adjustment that will follow, because if you say minimum wage is now 100,000 naira, for example, and then you increase it to 100, the person in civil service who was earning 100,000 has to have an increase as well. And then, other people, there's a consequential salary adjustment. And so when you put all of that into consideration, one wonders, are we ever going to get to a reasonable figure?
Well, like I did mention earlier, it's a value chain. Whatever policy the government makes, it extends to the private sector as well. Now, if the government increases the salary from, let's say, for example, from 48 to 100,000, the people in the private sector, the workers, will expect the salary also to be at par. But the question is this, or the answer, the solution is this. The government has to look into the private sector. How do we compensate the private sector for them to be able to commensurate with that figure? And what do? They have to look into a way of actually compensating the private sector by looking into their taxes. They could have a reduction in taxes. They could have tax holidays. They could have other benefits whereby the government supports them so that they wouldn't feel the draconic hardship that comes upon them. So whatever happens from the government, the public sector also has a reflection, or should have a reflection in the private sector as well. So for me, the government should work hand in hand. You see, one of the issues we have in this country is dissemination of information. Somebody just throws out anything without consultation. And that news goes around, blah, 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 and everybody just settle with it. Without proper dissemination of information. If you want to do anything, consult the people. Consult different NGOs, different civil society, the Labour Congress, the trade union, everybody. Get them on the table, round table. So they're going to be the one to pass that information back to their members. So information goes around. But what we do in this country mainly is some people sit in one place, decide what's going to happen, and they just through the announcements. So then there's crisis. I don't see the reason why the Nigerian Labour Congress should be having a deadlock with the government if they're properly consulted in the first place. But they will have sat together, agreed before the announcement has been made. So if you sit together, while you're having a consultation, nobody knows about it because except all those bodies that were supposed to be on the table. So after a proper consultation, they agree, then the information comes out. There will be peace because they will have passed on that information to their members. But we don't do that here. So information dissemination is the key here.
All right, so let me bring in Mr. Ugumbaju as well to get to because I was talking earlier about the states as well, and it will seem as though they are the major issue here in terms of this negotiation.
As far as I'm concerned, that makes a lot of economic sense, and it flows from the initial concern that we have all expressed here, where you put in the same basket a state such as Lagos, and then expect a state like Jigawa State or Ebonyi State to be operating at the same frequency and with the same capacity. It doesn't quite work well. The only distinction I have drawn is that through the agreement that precedes this minimum wage, it is expected that negotiations are had. All stakeholders, including the federating state entities, are expected to make their inputs reflecting their different peculiarities, and a common ground is found, and then a minimum wage is announced. But whether we like it or not, you have even put the figures across that some states are capable of paying this minimum. But we know as a fact that some other states in this country are even finding it difficult to pay the last minimum wage of 30,000. So moving forward, what would be the way out is to encourage the kind of collaboration, that kind of conversation that brings on board all the data, all the indices needed to appraise this situation in a way that gives the government and the people a clear picture of the state of the economy across board. That way, you are able to come to a figure that would neither be a burden or a free ride for any state. So, in other words, it cannot be this idea of negotiation and consultation and sensitization cannot be discountenanced. But what should not be allowed is to allow the period of time, the 5 year period of time to elapse before these discussions are commenced.
Mr. Gumadu, sorry, just to, I'm sorry, I have about I have about 3 minutes left. I just want to quickly, ask this question. That for some people say, look, this household of 6 indices used by the labor, it's not sustainable, because there are people in the civil service or in the workforce who do not have a family of 6 young people. That perhaps we should use what other clients are using, which is per hour pay. That if you say that, look, no one should earn less than 3,000 per hour, that makes more sense compared to saying a household of 6. I want to get your thought quickly on that and that of Mr. Adeleye as well.
Well, for me, I know that the devil is always in the details. But if that is the only problem that the people you are referring to have, then we are halfway through the problem. The reason being that it's not just about the number of the workers' family units that went into this calculus. Yes, I can understand that if you talk of a family of 6, by implication, you're also referring to the volume and quantity of food you can consume. And you can talk about the kind of funds that could go into Medicare if they fall ill, and so on and so forth. Transportation, the same thing. However, I think labor, to the extent that they went characterizing their the figure that they gave up, to the extent that they identified and were able to put figure to each head item, they did very well. And in some cases, it wasn't even a very, for instance, education. I understand education, they marked just 50,000 naira. So every education, I think public education. Now, how low can it get? I mean, you would tell that except you have your wards in public institutions, you don't know. I don't know of any school, at least around Lagos here, that pays less than 100,000 naira in the public schools that our children all attend. So let us not travel too far.
Mr. Gumadu, apologies. I have just a minute left, just 1 minute, and I want Mr. Adeleye to, also give his take as well on whether we should be doing the 6 households, with all the education or transportation, or just say per hour.
For me, neither is acceptable for me, because again, we're still going to come back to the issue of the minimum wage. Number of people per household is not going to work, because we're all not going to have the same number of households. So it's going to look like if I have 6, you have 2, that will have 3, and we're being paid the same amount of money. How does it work out? It's not going to all go well. Now, the per hour might be a little bit of a subtle, whereby if you get paid, but again, there will be a minimum wage per hour that needs to be paid. So that will be dependent on how many hours you work that determine how much you get paid. So that might be a little bit on the subtle.
Well, in UK, for example, if you're 16 to 20, there's, you're on a minimum wage. If you're 21 and above. 14 to 16. If you're 21 and above, there's also, you are now on the living wage. Maybe these are some of the, things that Labour can also consider. Thanks, to both of you. Human Capacity Development Professional Michael Adeleye, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And Human Rights Lawyer Malaki Gumadu, always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
That's Standpoint this week. Remember, you can watch the repeat broadcast at 11 p.m. tonight and 5 a.m. on Sunday morning. Thanks for watching. I am Precious Amayo.